They say history remembers kings by their victories, but the earth remembers them by their footprints of blood. Tonight, we walk into the breath between glory and terror, a place where the wind still whispers of a throne carved in fear, and the moon once hung above a city doomed to silence. A boy once stood at the edge of empire, quiet, observant, his hands small, his voice softer than court whispers. Yet in his gaze, the world saw something dangerous, a prophecy coiled like smoke around his destiny. He was not born a monster, but power has a language, and he learned to speak it fluently. He learned that an empire is not protected by walls alone, but by dread, by the promise that resistance is not simply futile, but fatal. There were nights when he walked palace corridors alone, surrounded not by guards, but by ghosts. Brothers never held, men never forgiven, a past sharpened like the knives of palace eunuchs. And with every quiet breath the gentle prince hardened, not in fury, but in calculation, not through rage, but purpose. Terror was not his temper, it was his instrument. In his silence, empires trembled. In his patience, cities prepared their own graves. A visionary, a conqueror, a shadow wearing a crown. When he finally spoke his destiny aloud, it was not shouted in triumph. It was whispered, like a ritual, like a blade sliding from its sheath. If the world does not surrender to my will, it will kneel to my fear. The boy became a sultan. The sultan became a storm. And the storm carried a single message. Resistance would not merely crumble, it would be erased. Before we face the siege towers and burning gates, before we hear the cries beneath shattered domes, before we witness what power does when it no longer fears consequences, understand this: he did not conquer simply to rule. He conquered to dominate the human mind, to carve loyalty, terror, and obedience into the bones of nations, to teach the world that an empire is not built by swords alone, but by nightmares that march long after the armies have passed. If history crowns him a hero, the earth remembers him differently. And tonight, you will hear both stories. Before we step into the shadows of empire, tap like to support this journey through history's hidden truths. Because once we begin, there is no turning back. Power does not arrive quietly. It demands a sacrifice long before it crowns a victor. In the hush after his first breath as sovereign, the palace walls listened, not for celebration, but for the tremor of fate sharpening into action. There are thrones won by prayer. There are thrones won by sword. And then there are thrones secured by silence, the kind carved when a life disappears before it has learned to speak. It began in shadowed chambers, where old men in embroidered robes debated the future of a world balanced on a newborn's heartbeat. Their voices were soft, but their meaning was iron. A sultan who hesitates loses his empire. A ruler who spares invites ruin. He was taught this truth not by victory but by threat. This empire had seen brothers turn to rivals, rivals to rebels, rebels to the very flames that consumed dynasties. A prince, they said, must inherit more than a crown. He must inherit the burden of deciding who lives so his realm does not die. From Byzantium to Persia, from Mongol steppes to Roman marble halls, history had whispered this law. An empire cannot share itself. So when the moment came, there was no rage, no trembling hand, no shout to the heavens begging forgiveness. Only a breath, only a choice. Only the cold acceptance that mercy was a luxury foreign to throne rooms and battle maps. What followed became legend wrapped in horror, a cradle stilled before morning, and a bloodline safeguarded by cruelty, disguised as duty. To rule, he severed the only bond untouched by politics. Not for hatred, but to prevent another war of brothers, another empire torn apart by competing heirs, another century drowned in civil strife. History would call it monstrous. The court called it necessary. With that single decision, he became more than a ruler. He became a guardian of survival through fear, and the empire took note. From Janissary barracks to Grand Vizier halls, a chill moved through the state like a new decree. This Sultan will not be challenged. For in those first hours on the throne, he did not simply eliminate a threat. He embraced a doctrine older than the crown itself, that stability is written in blood, and peace is built upon graves hidden beneath silk carpets and prayers. Thus began his reign not as a king of the living, but as master of consequences. The palace bowed. The empire steadied. The world, though it did not yet know, had gained a ruler shaped not by temper, but by calculated brutality. Speak of destiny, and some will tell you heaven chose him. Speak of terror, and it may seem hell played its part. But the truth lies in the space between, in a mind that understood power not as privilege, but as the divine right to decide who may breathe the empire's air. So ask yourself, when a ruler's first command is silence, what does he dream for the world that must kneel before him? Tell us in the comments. Do brutal beginnings create brutal rulers? Night fell over a world holding its breath, and when dawn returned, it found a young sultan standing before destiny itself. Not a battlefield yet, but a chessboard, a city crowned by legends wrapped in prophecies, believed by its people to be protected by heaven. Constantinople, the jewel that empires chased and dreams bled for, a city whose walls had humbled kings, whose very stones seemed to defy mortality. But the boy who became a blade in human form did not come with reverence. He came with calculation. And he brought with him a new kind of weapon, a future disguised as iron and fire. Before the first cannon roared, he waged a quieter war. Ships sealed the Bosphorus like a noose tightening around a throat, cutting breath, cutting hope, cutting time itself. Villages beyond the horizon whispered in dread. Merchants carried tales of a young ruler building engines of thunder, and rumor spread faster than any scout on horseback. The Sultan has forged giants of bronze that can shatter history. Each night, torches lined the horizon like a wall of stars arranged by a ruthless god. Each morning, drums rolled across the earth like an omen. He turned anticipation into agony, fear into a fortress stronger than Constantinople's walls. And then the earth itself trembled. A cannon unlike any the world had known inhaled the breath of fire and exhaled the end of an era. Stone split. Faith cracked. And hope, old and proud, flinched for the first time in centuries. But steel and gunpowder were only half the siege. He studied morale as if it were mortar and brick, knowing a heart breaks long before stone does. He offered clemency to some, to others the promise of ruin. Mercy as bait, cruelty as lesson. He understood that terror is sharpest when paired with opportunity. A door opened for those who bent the knee, and for those who stood defiant, there would be nothing left but memory and ash. When the walls finally yielded, and the dust of empire curled like funeral incense above the city, the victor did not revel. He reorganized, he repopulated, he reshaped a civilization as if molding clay with a steady, merciless hand. Families moved like pieces on a board, some torn from their homelands, others brought in to anchor a new order. A city once guarded by faith, rebuilt under command, not prayer. Where churches once echoed with ancient hymns, new voices rose in unfamiliar cadence. He did not merely capture Constantinople, he rewrote it. A metropolis reborn not by devotion, but by decree. And all who watched understood. The siege was not won when the walls fell. It was won long before. In minds he conquered with dread. In futures he strangled with inevitability, in his belief that history itself could be bent to will. If you value deep historical breakdowns like this, subscribe to Echoes of Time. We explore the world empires tried to bury. Empires do not endure by sword alone. Steel wins gates, but systems win centuries. And so, after banners rose over his conquered city, the young sultan turned not to celebration, but to redesigning the very structure of human lives. Conquest was only his opening act. The true performance was control. He did not rule bodies first. He ruled bloodlines. He looked upon villages and saw not families, but futures waiting to be sculpted. A child was not a child, but a seed to be uprooted, replanted, and trained to bloom in the shape he desired. This was not rage, nor vengeance, nor wild cruelty. It was design. Cold, methodical, brilliant, merciless. The Devshirme took shape like a shadow passing over fields. Hands reached into Christian homes, not to break them but to harvest them. Boys with strong shoulders, clear eyes, quiet spirits, taken from mothers who clutched them as though love alone might anchor fate. Tears fell. Names were whispered like final prayers. Not death. Something more complex. They vanished into the machinery of empire, losing their pasts so the Sultan could build a future loyal only to him. In marble courtyards, they were remade, faith reshaped, language replaced, identity stripped and reforged. From sons of shepherds came generals, viziers, commanders of thought and sword. Brilliance cultivated through brutal pruning, loyalty engineered by removing the possibility of any root but one. Where others saw humanity, he saw architecture, and each life was a pillar to place, a beam to reinforce, or a stone to discard. Wealth followed the same arithmetic. Gold flowed not like a river but like a calculation. Taxes, tributes, land seizures, trade monopolies, a treasury fed by obedience and drained by ambition. What could not be persuaded was relocated. What could not be relocated was replaced. Cities shifted like pieces under his hand. Families forced across mountains and seas, not because they sinned, but because they were useful somewhere else. Slavery did not crawl in the dark here. It stood upright in daylight, a foundation stone of politics and economy. Men and women traded as tools, loyalty purchased with flesh and labor, an empire woven with threads of captivity and command. Temples, churches, mosques, their stones did not matter. Loyalty mattered. Authority. Order. Faith itself reorganized beneath edicts and signatures, each prayer now an echo within a structure he controlled. He looked at the souls of his dominion the way an architect studies walls for stress fractures, reinforcing where needed, breaking where useful. Never sentimental, never hesitant. Not a tyrant raging against enemies. An engineer perfecting a design. An emperor whose cruelty did not scream. It calculated. It planned. It endured. Drop a like if you think history's power moves still echo today. Terror in his hands did not snarl or foam. It performed. It stood upon platforms and battlements, not as chaos but as message. A language carved not into parchment, but into the imagination of nations. In his empire, punishment did not whisper behind closed doors. It rose beneath open sky, where the sun could witness it, where merchants on dusty roads would pause, fishermen on distant shores would shudder, and kings across borders would feel an unease settle beneath their crowns. To rule men, he believed, you must first rule their sense of possibility. Hope must be narrowed. Defiance must be made unthinkable. And so, public justice was sculpted into theater, a stage where disobedience ended not quietly, but in silence so enormous the world dared not break it. Gallows and stakes did not appear at random. They were placed like punctuation across the empire, at crossroads where caravans passed, at ports where sails caught foreign winds, at city gates where citizens began their days and returned at dusk with eyes lowered, reminded of the price of breathing free in a world where freedom itself bent at the knee. The spectacle was ritual, measured, deliberate, not frenzy, choreography. Those chosen for the final lesson were not merely criminals, they were symbols, messengers of what awaited traitors, plotters, rebels, and sometimes simply those whose misfortune aligned with policy. The higher their status, the sharper the warning. A statesman disgraced at a harbor, a lesson to ambassadors. A nobleman displayed beyond city walls, a lesson to rivals. A rebel's follower raised before his village, a lesson to loyalty itself. Impalement, whispered in fear across continents, was not brutality for its own sake. It was psychological warfare cast into the horizon, a sentence designed not to kill swiftly, but to create memory. A memory that marched farther than armies, survived longer than banners, and took root deeper than any fortress foundation. The purpose was not simply to destroy a body, but to occupy the mind, to turn the mere thought of treason into a nightmare too heavy to lift. For every victim that faced the public judgment, 1,000 observers carried home the story, and 10,000 more heard it whispered in bazaars, sung in frightened tavern songs, sewn into lullabies that warned children that even shadows obeyed the Sultan. Fear became currency, a diplomatic instrument, an invisible army riding before envoys and soldiers alike. No proclamation was needed. His reputation traveled faster than banners, shaping treaties, stilling rebellions in the womb, and convincing rulers who dreamed of resistance to wake instead with trembling restraint. For some, terror is the end. For him, it was infrastructure, a framework upon which loyalty stood, ruling not only bodies, but imagination, not only territories, but futures. Empire to him was not stone and coin, but obedience etched into the soul. Comment your country. Where in the world are you watching echoes of time from? But even storms may find themselves reflected, and see in that reflection a force just as merciless, just as deliberate, just as willing to build obedience from the bones of the defiant. Across the Danube rose a prince carved not from silk and ceremony, but from hardship and hunger, shaped in a court where survival meant studying cruelty as one might study scripture. Vlad. A hostage once shaped under Ottoman discipline, returned to his homeland with the lessons of empire burning like coals beneath his ribs. He had learned from the Sultan's world, but he had not learned submission. He learned method. He learned fear. He learned the price of disobedience, and decided he would never again pay it. Two men, bound by shared history, twisted into rivals by ambition and pride, not a clash of armies, a collision of philosophies, terror facing terror, calculation facing calculation, each determined to prove that the other's shadow could be consumed. Diplomacy did not simply fray, it cracked like glass beneath a hammer. An envoy arrived, demanding loyalty. He left with nails hammered through his turban into his skull, not hidden, not concealed, but performed as declaration. I will not bow. Insult became provocation. Provocation became purpose. And the Sultan marched, certain he faced a petty rebel. Yet rebels do not stalk the night like hunters or whisper through forests like spirits. When Ottoman tents glimmered like scattered stars across the plain, Vlad came not as king, but as specter. Steel flared in the dark, and screams tore through fabric walls like torn silk. The Sultan, for the first time, felt breath brush the edge of mortality. A blade meant for his throat was stopped not by destiny, but by inches and instinct. The empire, vast and disciplined, steadied itself, pushed the night back and advanced into enemy lands to crush defiance at its root. But what they found was not rebellion. It was a vision. A message made flesh and wood, rising from the earth like a monument to defiance. Thousands of stakes, thousands of bodies. A silent forest crafted for the Sultan's arrival. A macabre mirror held up to his own doctrine. Not chaos, not madness. A reply. A demonstration that fear answers fear, and terror, when taught, may return with interest. Soldiers halted, breath lodged beneath their ribs. The air itself seemed to recoil, and for the briefest moment, the conqueror who ruled through dread felt dread rise to meet him. The campaign did not break, but it faltered. And in that hesitation lived a truth few dared whisper. Even the architect of nightmares may find himself wandering through one he did not design. Tap like. This story only gets darker,